the Old Testament. This is part of a series of videos designed to help you understand the Old Testament, and we're going to be looking specifically at the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. And I want us to spend some time now talking about Genesis. Genesis is the very first book, and a key word for understanding the book of Genesis actually is beginnings. It is the beginning of the Pentateuch. It's the beginning of the Bible. It tells us about the beginning of the world. It tells us about the beginning of the nation of Israel. And it also tells us about the beginning of God's great salvation plan. It was written by Moses originally for the nation of Israel as they were standing on the brink of the promised land. And they were scared. They were scared because their parents had failed to enter the promised land. So I'm sure they had heard rumors about how frightening a place this was for them. And this was a scary time because they had been living in the wilderness all of their lives. And they were to enter into this land and defeat the people who were living there and really be a means of God's judgment on those people. And so they needed to be reminded of God's promise, and they needed to be assured that God was able to keep that promise. And so Genesis serves as an introduction to the books of Moses and to the rest of the Bible as well. It helps the Israelites understand who they were, who God was, what God intended to do with them. And so in chapters 1 through 11, we get the beginning of the world. And really we have creation, the fall, the flood, and then chaos. And then in Genesis chapter 12 through 50, we find the beginnings of Israel. World, a problem in the world, Israel. God so loved the world, He chose Abraham. And so this is a foundational book. It tells us where we came from. It tells us who God is. It tells us what God is like. It tells us what the world was supposed to be like. It tells us why it's not. It teaches us about God's judgment on sin. And it points to Christ and the promises of salvation and the promises God makes to His people. And it reveals God's ability to keep His promises in spite of obstacles. It is, you might say, a story about how God can take evil and use it for good. God, you meant it for evil, God means it for good. Genesis proves that God can do that. It is quoted over 200 times in the New Testament. In fact, chapters 1 to 11 are quoted about 100 times, and it gives us a foundation for all the great doctrines of the Bible. And so we want to begin with Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we can summarize these chapters really in a word, God, or in a sentence, God creates the world with a word. And these chapters are going to tell us how the world began, which of course is interesting. That sounds like something that we should know. And as you know, these are chapters that in our day come under great debate because man is offering up an alternative version of how the world began. And man needs to, because if the Bible's version is true, then man needs to submit to God. And so they have to hate these chapters if they're going to do what they want to do and not submit to God. And sometimes their alternative view of how the world began sounds impressive and it seems intimidating, but we should understand it's nothing new. Man has been offering up an alternative version of how the world began for a long time now, even in Moses' day as well. And sometimes their version of events, everybody's talking about it, and their versions of events sounds so intimidating, but ultimately I believe this is divine revelation, Genesis 1 and 2. That means as I come to this text, I assume God knows what He's talking about. Probably the most important thing for me, I wasn't there and you weren't there. Only God was there, and I assume He knows what happened. And so as I look at this text, I submit myself to what God says because He knows better than I do. If He says it happened this way, it happened this way. And if you really want to dive deep into Genesis 1 and 2, I really would like to point you to a lecture by Abner Chou. And so I'm going to put it as a link after this. Genesis 1 and 2, listen to that lecture by Abner Chou. But I don't think we're only given this explanation of the beginning of the world as a kind of theoretical idea for us to debate about. In other words, we're not giving these chapters just as a means for us to argue with evolutionists. What we learn in the Bible about the beginning is essential because it answers some of the most fundamental questions we have about life in this world. In other words, I believe these chapters teach us that God really did create the world, but we don't want to miss the main point of these chapters, because the main point of these chapters is bigger than simply arguing against evolution. I often feel like when I'm witnessing, we have to go back to Genesis. Otherwise, people don't really even understand the questions the Bible is answering. I'm sure we've all come into a room at some point where people were watching a movie and we're like in the middle of that movie, and it's really difficult for us to figure out what the movie's about because we're missing the beginning. And that is the way it is with the Bible. Without a good understanding of the beginning of the Bible, we're going to have a hard time understanding a whole lot of what's going on in the rest of the story. Not only do these initial chapters in Genesis help us understand the Bible, they're also essential for understanding ourselves and what is happening in this world. I met with someone not too long ago, and we were talking about his life, things like work and his future and all of that. And I asked him, what's the purpose of your life? Now, it seems to me that understanding your purpose is pretty important. Who cares where you went to school if you don't know your purpose, right? That would be like knowing the names of the roads on a map, but not knowing where you're going. And yet that's something he didn't know, and that many people don't know. What's the purpose of my life? And we get answers to questions like that at the beginning of the Bible. If you want to know how something works, it's a good idea to look at how it was supposed to work before it was broken. Now, the way God goes about teaching these truths in Genesis 1 and 2, and I'm quoting here, is by providing two complementary descriptions of creation. So you have an introduction in 1:1, and then you have a panoramic view, 1:1 through 2:3, and then you have a zoomed in close-up in 2:4 and following. So the shift from the initial overview to the close-up is achieved by the special heading that comes in 2:4. It says, these are the generations, and those are like almost chapter titles. You'll see that throughout the book of Genesis, but it says in 2:4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And so that functions like a zoom-in lens on the camera, enabling the narrator to focus in on a smaller part of a larger scene. So Genesis 1, 2 through 3, through 2:3 gives us this big picture view of God's relationship with the earth, and Genesis 2:4 through 3:24 concentrates on the creation of the first human couple, Adam and Eve. It's more zoned in on God's relationship with man, and we'll see there's something awesome and grand about the first chapter and something personal and intimate about the second. And as we are looking at these chapters, we're going to see three main themes stand out, and I'm just going to give you the first as quickly as I can. God. That's the first main theme of Genesis 1 and 2. God. The hero of the book of Genesis is God. And this is our first introduction to the God of the Bible. And one of the key truths we learn about God from Genesis 1 and 2 has to do with his sovereignty and his purposes. The story of the creation of the world makes it clear there's only one God who rules this world, and he's in absolute control, and he rules this world for his people's good. And we're going to see in the next two themes that come out as we look at these chapters. In recounting the events of creation, the author has selected and arranged his narrative to focus in on God's creation of the land in order to bring blessing to man. But we can start digging in and asking what these passages teach us about the character of God. And we're going to do that in our next video.